the butcher's son. Jake Biggins didn't understand why all the folks who were attending his father's funeral were the ones who'd been mean and rude to him in life. Daniel Biggins, the butcher, the man who had sold them their meats and poultries. Jake couldn't help but stare at his father's coffin as it was being lowered into its final resting place, while letting his mind wander. How could this be? Why had these mean folks come here? It made no sense. Daniel Biggins ran the Biggins Butcher Shop for nearly 30 years before suffering a major stroke, which left him unable to work. That's why Jake had returned to the family business after going off after college and working as a medical examiner. Before his death, his father was much weaker physically and had lost all ability to speak clearly, though he could still understand others and had partial use of his left hand. So Jake had been completely willing to return home. He had planned all along to eventually take over his dad's business, so he didn't mind the pressing need. What had happened to his father was much more disastrous than having his college degree or career. Settled in a small town of Breckenridge, Virginia, Biggins Butcher Shop had one of the best reputations in all Southwest Virginia. The meat was always fresh, sold in large portions, for good prices, and his father was always friendly with his customers. He was also smart with his money, but somehow left Jake with little to almost nothing, which made Jake suspicious. The stroke had affected his dad's body, but not his mind. The good financial decisions never stopped, which was one of the reasons why his shop had been so successful up until a year before his death. That's when the business started to go downhill. After the service finished, the crowd began to disperse. Jake walked up to the edge of the grassy area and stood under a tree. He lit a cigarette and took a deep draw from it, trying to relax. He had done all the crying that he needed to do in the privacy of his own home. His heart was broken that he'd lost his father, but it had been a long time coming. It was almost a relief to Jake that his father was no longer suffering from the pain he had endured over the past year. One of the gravediggers walked up to Jake afterwards and said, "I'm sorry about your father. He was a good man, an honest man. He once gave my family and me some free meat when my family went through some hard times. I'll never forget him for that." Jake shook his head and said, "Thank you. I appreciate that. And I want to thank you again for giving my father his one last wish." The gravedigger nodded and walked away. "Well, I thought this was never going to happen," Jake heard from the other side of the large tree. Two townspeople had stopped and been talking to each other in low voices. Jake frowned, wondering why they couldn't wait until after they left the cemetery to have their conversation. As they continued talking, Jake stood in utter shock, listening. "He was a sick, stupid man," the first voice continued. "Yes, he was, and I'm going to miss that," the other voice said. Jake's frown deepened when he finally realized the voices. It was Mrs. Louise Fawcett and Mrs. Gina Tremblay, known best friends and the biggest gossipers in town. He flicked his cigarette with his thumb and took another draw, continuing to listen, glad that the smoke coming from his lips and his cigarette were floating away from the two ladies. "Oh, yes, I suppose you are right. I don't know." Gina sounded as though she was not quite sure what she was talking about. "Mr. Biggins was so gullible to believe me every time I told him that I paid for the beef last week." "I always thought so. I was so relieved when Jake went off to college and not be around. Just imagine if Jake stayed behind. Nobody would be able to trick Mr. Biggins into giving us stuff that we didn't pay for," Gina said. "And what about that young man Dexter? He would always help Mr. Biggins with all that heavy lifting and cutting, especially after he had that damned stroke," Gina said. "Yeah, more like he helped himself to extra sausages whenever Mr. Biggins wasn't paying any attention," Louise said as she and Gina laughed out loud. "Dexter? No ways. I don't believe he would do that to my dad. I can't believe it," Jake thought to himself. When Louise responded, Jake could tell this wasn't the first conversation the two of them ever had about his father. "Too bad he trusted everyone too easily," said Gina. "Makes you wonder if being good is worth a dime anymore. It doesn't look to me like he gained anything good from it," Gina giggled. "Good doesn't get you any good in return. Poor Mr. Biggins couldn't figure that one out," Louise responded in a firm tone. But I'm more worried about not getting any more free stuff from Biggin's meat shop now that his son is back. Jake doesn't seem to be as dull as his dad, but I'm telling you now that we can't fool Jake. We just gotta go with the flow, earn Jake's trust, and eventually someone will know how to take advantage of him, Louise said. That is true, but he's been away for nearly 7 years. I'm not too sure how long it'll take, but maybe Dexter can gain his trust and go back to work there, Gina said. Let's head back to the car and go to Starbucks for some iced frappuccino, Louise suggested. Jake's blood began to boil as he listened to the two ladies talking crap about his father and how easy it was to trick his father to the point of him losing all of his money and his business. You didn't find it odd the way Jake looked at you? That stare? I will never forget it, Jeannie. I'm telling you, it was like he was boring into my soul. I had to get out of that shop quick a few times. Well, maybe he just thought you were pretty, Lou. He never looked at me in a way that made me uncomfortable. Well, he did it to me, and I don't think it was all in my mind. So you could just forget that thought. I wasn't going to say that. I wouldn't be surprised if you did. The women's voices trailed off as they finally walked away, leaving Jake to see over their crass words. Words they had not even bothered to leave the cemetery to say. He flicked his cigarette out into the grass, stuffed his hands into the pockets of his suit pants, and strolled to his black 72 Impala, a car his father had restored for him as a gift on his 20th birthday. It was a beauty of a ride. Jake was extremely proud of it. He slid into the driver's seat and sat for a moment, thinking about his dad. Father was such a great businessman that he failed. Jake thought it might be a good idea to thoroughly recheck his accounting books. If he had to bet, he'd say his dad might have used a computer program, but was more likely to have things written down in ledgers. When he was growing up, he could remember watching his father poring over several ledgers spread out on the coffee table. He always had a pencil stuck above his ear in case he needed it, and another in his hand to write with. He told Jake once that it was because when he wore down the pencil he was using, he could take the one from behind his ear without having to get up and sharpen the first pencil. Jake smiled. It was a good memory. He started the car and drove away from the cemetery, feeling like he was leaving behind something more important to him than anything else. A treasure he would never have again. He fought back the tears and drove toward the butcher shop, wanting to be around the things his father had left behind. He pulled into the drive. The shop was closed, of course, and there were no cars in the parking lot. Just after he pulled into a spot and was getting out of the car, a sharp-looking Jeep Wrangler pulled up beside him. He looked over the Impala at the driver. It was his old friend, Mark Clark. Jake lifted his chin in a one-nod greeting. "What's up, Mark Clark?" He teased his friend unceasingly all throughout school because his name rhymed. The only reason Mark let him get away with it was because Jake had also stuck up for the smaller boy, keeping the bullies away. "Hey, I need some meat, man." "That's what I've heard," Jake teased him, closing the door to the Impala and flipping the keys around his hand as he walked around the car to talk to Mark. Mark grinned and shook his head. "No, man, I need a big slab of meat for the party tomorrow. I know it's not the best of timing, but I'm hoping you'll come. My friends and I had this bonfire party planned for 3 months, and I'd hate to have a good time without you." "Well, that's mighty nice of you, Mark. I did plan to be there. Dad wouldn't want me to stop living and having fun because he isn't here to share it with me. Your dad hasn't had fun in a long time. Or hadn't, I guess. I'm real sorry I couldn't go to the burial." "It's okay, man. You came to the funeral at the church. Besides, the cemetery's kind of small. You would have taken up too much space anyway." Both men laughed. Mark was a small boy in high school, and a small man when he grew up. "Come on, I'll set you up." Jake gestured with his head toward the shop, and both men went inside after Jake unlocked it. An hour later, Jake was sitting in the butcher's shop office, gazing at the stack of ledgers in front of him. It wasn't huge, just the ones from this year. There were only 4 of them. Summer was just ending, and fall brought on bonfires and cookouts. The holidays were on the way, and the air would soon turn crisp and cold. Jake lifted the top ledger, set it to the side, and flipped it open. It was a nice book, leather bound with green trim. He scanned down the page of numbers and terms his father had used for the business. Some of them he recognized. He knew that B stood for beef and P stood for pork. He He knew most of the shorthand his father used when writing in his ledgers, after having watched him keep track of his sales and purchases while growing up. The last ledger was different from the others, gold with red trim. Jake could see it as soon as he opened the book. It did not have numbers or shorthand terms. It was a list of names. Beside each name was a short memo. Jake read through the names and memos, chills covering his body. The list was his father's assessment of customers, which was everyone in town over the age of 20. He spotted Luis and Gina's names. Of course they would be included. They were his customers. As he read through the memos, he realized that Luis's assessment of his father had been fairly close to the truth. Dad had observed everyone in the small town and made notes on them. There were spaces left under some names so that Dad could add something if he needed to. Stunned, Jake read what was written after Luis's name. Petty face, nice body, but the personality of a can of beans. Disappointed. His father had skipped to the next line and started with the date, as he did with all the others. Came in for a pound of ham, wrote a bad check. There were more names. As he scanned the list, he noticed the further he got, the more the notes seemed malicious. The people in the small town had tried to get away with as much as possible. Dad had observed several of them stealing. He knew who had broken into his shop the year before, but he had never prosecuted. Many of the people who bought from him evidently considered him to be retarded or slow, and would speak to him as though he was a child. On another note, he wrote, I always saw Dexter hiding a case of ground beef in a large bag, then watched him take all the rubbish bags out to the dumpster, except for the bag with the meat in it. He puts it in his car. Jake's temper began to rise as he continued reading. Dexter's friends bullied me outside my shop after I talked to them about the missing beef. While Jake had been off at college, his father had been beaten up, robbed, spat on, and laughed at by some of the men in town. He'd had the tires in his car punctured, all 4 of them. He knew who did it. He did nothing about it. Jake was reminded of high school, and how Mark had been lured by other boys into alleys or down to the football field. There, they would have a good time beating him up or pushing him around. They called him names, pulled his pants down in public, and did whatever they could to humiliate him. It seemed the treatment of those high school boys was mirrored by their parents in what they did to Dan Biggins, and even the women had joined in to torture his dad in whatever ways they could. Jake closed the ledger, shaking with anger. It was as though all of Breckenridge had been determined to make his father's life as miserable as possible. He steepled his fingers together and taped his lips with them, thinking. His father was no longer able to get revenge. Jake continued reading. I don't feel mad at the people of Breckenridge. Instead, I feel pity for all of them because of their ignorance. I can change this town, Jake. I really can. But I need your help to do it. On the next page, follow the instructions very carefully. It was up to him. How have you been, Jake? Louise Fawcett asked in a friendly voice. Jake looked up from the chopping board, where he was carving off the fat from a large chunk of beef. He forced a smile, like he'd been doing for every customer over the last few months since his father's death. I'm doing well, Mrs. Fawcett. And you? I'm doing just fine, thanks. I need to get a 5-pound pork roast, please. Jake moved away from the chopping block, glancing back at the knives laying on the counter beside it. Seasoned or unseasoned? Oh, seasoned, of course. I'm so glad your father passed down the recipe for his seasoning. I have never had meat that tastes quite so good as what I get here. Why, I would say that the ground beef is my absolute favorite. She smiled wide and leaned against the counter with a seductive look on her face that made Jake want to vomit. His smile was frozen, however. He wasn't going to give himself away to this woman. I don't suppose you would ever consider telling anyone the secret to that seasoning, would you? Jake chuckled. No, ma'am. That would make my dad roll over in his grave. Well, we can't have that, can we? Jake looked down as Louise rifled through her purse and pulled out a checkbook. Sorry, Mrs. Fawcett. Not taking checks here anymore. Louise's face fell, and she stared at him in disappointment. Oh, when did you start that? I wrote a check in here last week. Jake shook his head. No, ma'am. You paid cash. I had to stop taking checks. My dad's system was old, and I had to, tweak things. Get it all converted to a computer. You know the deal. It's a technical world we live in. I have to insist, Mrs. Fawcett, and I do apologize. Louise did not lose her frown. Well, I know you have a business to run, but that is truly very disappointing, Jake. Your dad always took my checks. I know. I do apologize. The empty words fell from Jake's mouth, and he was glad he could keep a straight face through it all. He kept picturing plunging one of the knives into Louise's neck, or smashing a bottle over her head. The thoughts kept preventing him from showing his feelings on his face. He'd learned to mask it with everyone except Mark. As she went through her wallet for the right amount of cash, he wrapped up the pork roast in a paper sack and put a band around it. I will forgive you because I really appreciate the honor you're granting the citizens here in Breckenridge. What do you mean? Jake knew what she meant. You know, the names. How you've given different slabs of meat names to honor the people that have left or disappeared or moved. I hear you recently named a certain selection of meats after Mr. Tremblay's dog, Trevor. I know how much Mr. Tremblay misses that dog. Such a shame. But we can't keep pets from running away, can we? And how you named an entire day sale of meat after Junior Milton's grandmother? This is quite nice of you, Jake, I must say. Well, thank you, Mrs. Fawcett. I do want the people here to know that I think about them all the time. I have a list of names right here. He tapped his temple. And I want to honor everyone who has ever meant anything to my father. This is just one way of showing tribute to them. And here is a free tray of our big and special ground beef with herbs. Jake smiled. Oh, really, Jake? This here is to show our gratitude to the folks like yourself, Mrs. Fawcett. Jake smiled again. It is a lovely idea. Louise handed over the cash and picked up her meats. Well, I have to meet up with some friends. I'm having a little get-together this afternoon. You take care of yourself now, you hear? Yes, ma'am. And you too. Have a lovely day. Thank you, dear. He watched as she walked out with the seasoned pork roast and a tray of ground beef made from his father's corpse, while running his tongue over his teeth, holding in the sneer until she was outside. He turned and went into the back room and pulled the door open and went into where a table stood, and knives strewed across the top of it. Next to it, his father's corpse, hung like a slab of meat on a hook, waiting to be carved up. Jake picked up one of the knives and turned to the smaller slab of meat on the stainless steel table. All right, Trevor, it's time to feed your master. The end.